Okay, the fourth lesson looks at some more of Hitler's actions between 1936 and 1938. Of course, we will only probably go up to the Anschluss of Austria, leaving some of the rest of 1938 to be dealt with in another lesson. But some really interesting stuff happens, and we're going to start with one of my favorite subtopics of, well, let's just say modern history, the Spanish Civil War. Spain's a fascinating place. In 1936, Spain breaks out in civil war between two factions, and these factions are as varied and as mixed as one can imagine. The bottom line is this: Spain was a democracy since about 1920. They, before that, were a monarchy. Spain had been ruled by a king and a queen. The king and the queen, following the First World War, which Spain played a limited role in, mostly, but then afterwards suffered greatly from an economic crisis, because what Spain had done during the First World War is export lots of raw materials and textiles. They made uniforms for the majority of the countries fighting in the war, et cetera, et cetera. And after the war, there was no more market for this stuff. So Spain went into a massive economic crisis, which culminated in the end of the monarchy. The royal family, which, to be fair, hadn't done a lot of good for Spain in about 50 years, other than starting a football team known as Real Madrid, hence Royal Madrid, flees and they go off to live in Rome. Spain is run by a democratic government between 1921 and 1936 as a republic, so it's known as a republican government. This republican government has a massive difficulty dealing with Spain's problems. Spain, as a result, breaks out in civil war in 1936. Now, the Republican group, the ones defending the government that was in existence before 1936, was known as the Popular Front. And it's not a unified group by any measure of unity. It includes socialist Democrats, so people who believe in a socialist-style Spain, but one that is still a democracy. It involves anarchists. Anarchists don't believe in government whatsoever, but for anarchists to join the Republicans, it is really a lesser of two evils choice. They would rather have a socialist democratic republic rather than a fascist dictatorship, which is what the other side's obviously fighting for. And the last group is a group known as the syndicalists. And the syndicalists, or syndicates, are another word for trade unions. And they are basically, and in every way, shape, and form, a communist party. They're even supported by the Russians. Okay? They're fighting against the nationalists. And the nationalists either want one of two things. They would like to create a fascist government like Nazi Germany or fascist Italy in Spain, and they're led by a rebel general named Francisco Franco, and they also are allied with a group known as the monarchists, who very easily to determine what they want, they would like the exiled Spanish royal family to return and rule them, as is their rightful birthright, effectively. So you have these two groups fighting each other. And Spanish Civil War is really interesting, mostly because it draws international attention. The Spanish Civil War is as much about the involvement of other countries around the world as it is about the Spanish themselves. It also, because the factions are so different, leads to a whole bunch of really interesting stories. One of the interesting things, and I'll go on to this, is the fact that different regions of Spain break up. And if you look at Spain when it splits in two, it's not a unified split like north versus south. It is literally different regions pockmarked. So Spain basically looks like a checkerboard with different regions supporting each side. And eventually, the person who will unify all of the regions into the biggest single block will probably win this war. Now, bottom line, one of the cool little stories of this, and this is one of my favorite pictures of all time, and when I was in Barcelona, I made a little pilgrimage to this very place. Not necessarily because I'm a rabid socialist or far be it an anarchist, probably quite opposite, but what it symbolizes is just one of the neat, really fascinating moments in history. The city of Barcelona is overwhelmingly supportive of anarchy. And the Anarchist Party takes over Barcelona in the fall of 1936. And one of the things they do is they abolish all forms of government and all forms of private ownership. They turn over the, Ritz-Carlton Hotel, where this picture is taken, one of the fanciest and best hotels in all of Barcelona, to the workers. They forced the people who used to own the factories and used to employ lots of people. So in other words, the people who, in their minds, abused their workers, and they made them work for free, feeding the workers who ate and dined at the finest restaurant in Barcelona for free. And this is a picture of the famous dining room in the Ritz-Carlton, Barcelona. The men in ties are the former business owners, and as you can see, the people at the table are the poor and the working classes who have never eaten at the Ritz Barcelona, but now they're allowed to eat there for free and be served by their former bosses. I just think that story is crazy and amazing, but at the same time, one of the interesting parts about the anarchist situation in Barcelona is the fact that it completely dissolves in about 6 months. One of the things about anarchy is, I suppose it's a nice idea, no one needs government, everyone can look after themselves, share and share alike, everybody puts their sort of individual self-interest aside and gets on with life. I mean, an idea, but human beings, again, don't work like that. And one of the things that happens in Barcelona is within a very, very short period of time, the city basically turns on itself. People start taking charge. Other people start vying to be almost mini leaders within an anarchist state in Barcelona. And the city goes into absolute chaos. They abolish money, but below the surface, a black market returns. And by the start of 1937, Barcelona is in utter chaos, and Franco and the Nationalists march into Barcelona easily, murder most of the anarchist leaders, and take over Barcelona and enforce a fascist dictatorship on the province of Catalonia, which is where Barcelona is from. If you want to read something really interesting, George Orwell spends a little bit of time in Barcelona at the heyday of the anarchist movement. So really at the start, when it looks like they were creating a different world, and he writes glowingly about what's happening in Spain, only to leave after a few weeks, and within months, the thing turns on itself, and it's a chaotic hellhole. Anyways, I just wanted to share that story with you. It's just interesting. So as I said, the Spanish Civil War, as you can tell, is a battleground of ideologies. Republicans actually get supported by the Russians. The Russians send planes, they spend pilots with those planes, they send weapons and money to the Republicans, hoping that at the end of this war, that once the Nationalists are defeated, the faction within the Republican Party that's able to be the strongest would be the Communists, and then Spain would become another communist country. As you recall from the Anti-Comintern Pact, the Russians are actively trying to foster rebellion in other countries around the world through the use of this organization known as Comintern. And Comintern sees massive potential for a communist future in Spain, and therefore the Russians back up and support the Republican side. Also, you have thousands, that's tens of thousands of international volunteers from all around the globe. Britain and Ireland are probably some of the countries that send the most people. These aren't actually sent by the government. These are people who just effectively go there. They join what are known as the international brigades, and they do so because of their communist sympathies. One of the interesting side notes about all of this is that the international brigades, especially the British and Irish ones, are a lot of made up of people from East London. Down the East London Docklands in the time of the 1930s, there was a huge communist movement that was trying to, establish a Britain that is more socialist, or at least very communist. And a lot of the people who are fighting on this side are Jews. So actually, disproportionately speaking, the British international brigades are made up of East London Jews. I've taught some kids who in the past have had family members who, great uncles or grandfathers, who had actually gone to Spain to fight in these international brigades. International brigades come from all over the world. They come from America, they come from Canada, Australia, some come from the Middle East. 50 countries send people or have people go to join these international brigades. Most of them end up getting killed over there because the Spanish Civil War is absolutely horrible. And their sort of idealism is crushed very quickly when they see just how corrupt everything is in Spain. Britain and France actually don't get involved, though France does send some weapons. Then the major reason they don't get involved is they don't want to be seen supporting the side that the Russians are. They're very worried, especially France, about growing communism in their own country, and they don't want to be supporting a side that is in some way, shape, and form communist, because it would be seen as hypocritical to deny the rights of the communists within their own country, so they stay well out. One of the reasons the nationalists actually win this war is the fact that, on the other hand, the support they get is strong and concentrated. The fascist dictatorships of Italy and Germany see wonderful opportunity to get a new friend in a fascist dictator, and they see Francisco Franco as being that guy. Italy will send thousands of troops and tanks, and Germany will send aircraft and pilots in something known as a Condor Legion, and they will play a pivotal role in this war. Italy and Germany take part in most of the major campaigns of this war and really are decisive in leading the nationalists to ultimate victory. The effect of German involvement is probably more pressing. Initially speaking, Franco and his army were in North Africa. I'm not sure if you knew this or not, but up until about 1940, really, large parts of sort of western Morocco, as we know it today, were actually controlled by Spain. And Francisco Franco and the nationalists and the majority of his army were all in North Africa. They had no way of getting across because the Republicans had control of all of the boats, so they had to be flown across. And it's the Germans who jump in here to fly the Spanish army across so Franco can lay siege to Madrid. Additionally, the Germans will force or sort of pressure people to surrender by bombing Spanish cities. And you get a real preview of World War II in the Spanish Civil War, most notably with the bombing of the Spanish town of Guernica, which is in the northern Spain Basque region. And Guernica becomes the subject of a famous painting by the famous artist Pablo Picasso. But it's probably most widely why it's known because of this painting, but at the same time it is a massive preview into World War II. And leaders around the world can see the devastating effect of a modern war if it were to happen again. And this sort of weighs on their minds when they're considering whether or not to appease Hitler, because the Spanish Civil War proves to everybody that nobody really wants to get involved in a modern war because it's going to have disastrous consequences. The Spanish Civil War is incredibly bloody and horrible. Anyways, in large part due to this, of course, Franco wins this war and is able to rule Spain as a fascist dictatorship, which has massive consequences for world peace and peace in Europe. The German and Italian forces gain lots of experience and confidence because they're on the winning side. Mussolini and Hitler are brought together in closer bonds of friendship, and you'll see why this is important a little bit later in the lesson. Britain, again, not intervening, makes Hitler think that, again, that Britain could be persuaded to stay out of a modern war. So if he were to expand, let's say, into Czechoslovakia or into Poland, he believes more and more and more that Britain's basically going to do nothing. Not only that, the devastating impact of things like Guernica and modern warfare as evidenced in Spain weighs heavily on the mind of particularly the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, and can be one of the reasons why he was keen to avoid war at all costs. And the policy of appeasement may be understood a little bit more in this context. Also, too, the USSR's relationship with the West, something that you'll pick up in Unit 4 when we look at what happens after the Second World War. The USSR's relationship with the West begins to sour at this particular point. They start to see Britain and France as suspicious. These are countries who they have to fight the Second World War with, but ultimately don't support them, which makes Stalin, I suppose, less willing to work with them in the post-war era, and as such leads to the explosion of the Cold War in 1945. So what did Hitler hope to achieve by this? Hitler gets most of his aims. The big one, of course, that he wanted to is probably the biggest disappointment for him. He wanted another buddy, and he wanted to gain another ally in a potential new world war in Franco. He does get a new friend. Spain does support Germany minorly in the Second World War, but they do remain neutral. Spain barely gets involved whatsoever. Their support of Germany is effectively limited to allowing German ships to refuel in Spanish harbors, and at one point they send a group known as the Blue Legion to fight on the Russian front against the Soviets in 1942. But Franco stays out of the Second World War, and he had really hoped at this particular point that, Spain on the western border of France, Italy on the southeastern border, Germany on the eastern and northeastern border of France, he would have France completely surrounded. But Franco refuses to join the Second World War, mostly because his army is completely exhausted and he doesn't have any more money after fighting a huge, long civil war that lasts over 3 years in his own country. But he gets a friend, but not an ally. But the other things he does quite well. The German army, especially the Air Force, the Luftwaffe, gets tested and trained. It becomes a massive dress rehearsal for World War II, and the techniques that they learned in the Spanish Civil War are revolutionary, and they're able to use these against the Poles and the French in 1939 and 1940 to win quick victories. It also brings Mussolini and Germany very much closer together, which will have important consequences. It disassociates Mussolini from his connections with Britain and France. And this is very important in terms of the Anschluss of Austria, as we're about to see. He also hoped the civil war in Spain would distract foreign diplomats. In other words, they would be so concentrated on what's going on in Spain and maybe trying to stop the civil war that they would be sort of not interested or pay less attention to his exploits elsewhere. And Spain does act as a smokescreen for Hitler's ambitions in Austria and Czechoslovakia. The aforementioned, and briefly, albeit the Anti-Comintern Pact, is what happens next. So this is really the second thing that happens. In 1936, Japan is firmly under a military control. We talked about the fact that Japan was coming under military control in 1931 during the invasion of Manchuria, but by 1936, it's totally under military control. It's led by this man here, the nationalist military leader, General Hideki Tojo. Tojo is supported by the business community, who sees that an expansive Japan, a Japan that's going to go and collect an empire, will be really good for business. And they see a massive chance to profit from Japan's expansion of its empire. And in 1937, they invade China. Some say this is the first campaign of World War II. Now, Hitler and Mussolini seize on the potential for having a new ally. They see they have much in common with the Japanese, and in 1936 they sign an Anti-Comintern Pact. And this is a pact that basically says we will support each other if invaded by the Soviet Union. They use the word Comintern. This Comintern is the organization of the Soviet Union, which is meant to foster communist rebellion in other countries. And it basically promises that Germany and Japan would assist if the Soviets invade. They're probably not going to invade, but what it does do is it establishes a broad alliance between Germany, Japan, and eventually, 1937, Italy. And this alliance is called the Axis, and this brings these three countries, the primary belligerents of the Second World War, close together. And this is a concerning aspect for Western powers, the fact that you have now three strong military dictatorships really spanning the globe when you bring in Japan, that are unified under a common cause and will protect each other. It's a scary thing for world peace. Which brings us to the third and last thing, the Anschluss of Austria. As we all know, one of Hitler's foreign policy aims was to unite all German-speaking people into the Reich, or the German Empire, to form a greater Germany. And the largest concentration of German-speaking people was in Austria. There were 7 million of them there. The union of the two was actually a popular idea, but of course it was forbidden in both the Treaty of Versailles and the Treaty of Saint-Germain. Now, for hundreds of years, people in Austria had talked about unifying Germany and Austria, but it wasn't really feasible before the First World War because the Austrian Empire was so big and expansive, and they were doing okay by themselves. But after the Second World War, when the Austrian Empire was torn apart, the majority of Austrians felt it was necessary to unify with Germany, and Germany felt the same, but of course it was forbidden by the Treaty of Versailles. So the union of the two is actually a very popular idea, and this isn't something new that Hitler creates. He really seizes on popular sentiment in both countries. Which brings me to the picture on the right. Here we have a good Canadian, Christopher Plummer, ripping up a Nazi flag, as he does as Admiral von Trapp in the movie The Sound of Music. And one of the important things to consider is that The Sound of Music, well, being my wife's favorite movie and marginally okay TV, some nice songs, I suppose. Most Austrians are like Admiral von Trapp. In fact, most Austrians enthusiastically welcome the Nazis. And one of the, I suppose, things I always chuckle about, being the historian that I am about The Sound of Music, is that especially amongst the upper classes, which von Trapp was, they were very much in support of the Anschluss of Austria. Now, another thing I find funny, and I don't know if anyone has ever wondered this, but have you ever looked at a map? Austria is completely landlocked. They have no ports. How would Austria have an admiral and a navy such as to create the position for one illustrious individual such as Admiral von Trapp? Anyways, The Sound of Music, in my opinion, doesn't make any sense. But hey, nice story, pretty scenery, nice singing, Canadian actor. I'll give it a pass. But check your historical accuracy, von Trapp. Anyways, Anschluss with Italy. The big issue for Hitler was Italy. Hitler, of course, was courting that relationship with Mussolini, and Italy is important. But Italy is very much against the Anschluss of Austria. Italy is against the Anschluss of Austria because it hates Austria. In fact, Italy and Austria had been long-term enemies. They had fought against each other for, well, in a bunch of different cases over about 150 years. And they were really against a unified and strong Austria on their border. Now, Italy had fought most prominently and most recently Austria in the First World War. And you'll recall that Italy wanted large portions of Austria in the peace settlement, but doesn't get it. That's why they called it the mutilated victory. And in 1934, events sort of go about creating a worry for the Italians, because what happens in 1934 is Austrian sympathizers actually kill the, Austrian Nazi sympathizers kill the Austrian chancellor in cold blood. They assassinate him. And it looks for a short time in 1934 that Austria is going to fall to a Nazi government, and that Nazi government will push forward with the unification of Germany and Austria. Italy in 1934 is so against this that Mussolini moves his army to the border of Austria and threatens the invasion of Austria if Hitler pushes forward with unification. And of course, Hitler backs down. Hitler is quite fond of Mussolini at this particular point, and he's certainly in 1934 in no position to stand up to the Italians, who have been rebuilding their army since 1922. And even though we know the Italians don't have a phenomenal army, it's certainly better than Germany's in 1934, and as such, they back down. But in a very short period of time, things change. Of course, the Spanish Civil War rolls around, and Hitler and Mussolini become closer friends, and he's able to establish a better relationship and use this better relationship to get approval from the Italians to unify Austria. Now, it's also part of, partially due to the fact that Hitler now, by 1938, most certainly is in a stronger military and diplomatic position than Italy. Hitler meets, as a result of this, Austrian Chancellor, a man named Sudetenland, to discuss the persecution of Austrian Nazis by the Austrian government. Completely ridiculous pretense for it. And he uses that meeting to effectively bully him. In one of the crazier meetings in diplomatic history, Hitler yells at him for a reported 3 hours straight without getting a word in. Literally wears him down, screams at him, throws things around the room until Schleswig backs down and appoints a Nazi, a man named Sias Inkart, as Minister of the Interior. Schleswig suspects that Hitler wants to destroy Austrian independence, which he does, and he decides that he's going to try and get around this by putting the vote, or putting the choice to the Austrian people on the 13th of March, 1938. When Hitler hears that Schleswig's going to do this, he says, well, that's it. I can't risk a plebiscite. Hitler's riding a wave of personal popularity, and if he loses this vote, it will look bad on him, and it will ruin, or at least ruin, his sense of infallibility, which is very important to him at this particular time. So he decides to act. Okay. Hitler finds out about this. He demands that Schleswig is replaced with Sias Inkart, and in a phone call which lasts 5 hours, in which Hitler basically screams at him again for 5 hours straight, he gives in and appoints him as Sias Inkart as Chancellor of Germany, who, once he takes over as Chancellor, then appeals to Germany for help to restore order, because Austria is, and I'm making air quotes here, in massive danger of revolution. Not true, but again, it's a pretext for Hitler on the 12th of March, 1938, marching his troops into Austria. He does this, and he proclaims that Austria and Germany had been unified, or Anchluss. To confirm the legitimacy of this unification, he holds a plebiscite in April 1938, of which 99% of Austrians vote in favor of the union of Germany and Austria. It's important to note also that the Nazis use intimidation. Of course, around the voting booths are the SS and the Gestapo, sort of telling people or indicating how they should vote. But in reality, most historians tend to agree that regardless of intimidation, most Austrians would have voted for union anyway, and therefore the Anschluss is legitimized. Now, the consequences of Anschluss are important, because this is a massive break of both the Treaty of Saint-Germain and the Treaty of Versailles, and it's the most daring action to date of Adolf Hitler. It's the first time the German army had been deployed over its frontiers. And again, Britain and France do nothing. They issue some protest to Germany, but that's it. They both agree that there's little they can do without Italy. Italy borders Austria, and Italy is really the only country only country in position to really invade Austria at this particular moment. Italy, as you know, is now firmly in the camp of Nazi Germany, and Britain and France, without the support of Italy, agree there's nothing they can do. Not only that, after the plebiscites are held, they agree that any action would have been contrary to the wishes of the Austrian people, so they again back down. Hitler, as a result of this, increases his territory, population, and his resources, particularly coal, which would be important for building his war machine and maintaining his war machine for a Second World War. And he also increases his confidence and contempt for the British and the French, who he sees as basically powerless now and he sees that they have no willingness to do anything to stop him. So the Anchluss of Austria, the 12th of March, 1938, is Hitler's boldest move to date, and the last thing we'll talk about for this lesson. Hope you enjoyed that. I hope you now look at the sound of music as a different thing, and I hope you do pick up some books about the Spanish Civil War. It's one of the most fascinating things of the 20th century, and actually something that's oftentimes ignored because we tend to skirt over it as sort of something that's sort of a stepping stone to World War II. But the Spanish Civil War is fascinating. Not to mention, of course, all of this stuff is fascinating, and I hope you enjoy it.